they created it as a memorial of some kind?
No, actually, it's a working courtroom.
It's a working courthouse for what's there, not
Bavarian State Court.
The Bavarian State Court, because the Court of European Justice is in Strasbourg, right?
Yeah. And The Hague.
And The Hague.
And so we were both there. John and I had a chance.
That must have been a fascinating trip. Thank you.
And a chance to we actually signed a protocol agreement between the city of Nuremberg and the Robert H. Jackson Center.
Good.
So for us, it was a wonderful opportunity, and I'm sure going to.
Well, you're going to have to give me a quote. I'm speaking to the Military Court of Appeals on Thursday, which is why I have to leave so early in the morning. And I want to talk. I want to preach the religion to the Antichrist. I want to talk to them about the importance of international tribunals for why we need an extra territorial code of justice, particularly pushing toward the new criminal court, which I think is one of the ideas that makes a lot of sense and has not gotten much shrift in this administration.
Right.
So give me a good quote from Jackson.
Well, we got the perfect guy right here.
Okay.
Nobody knows more than
Okay.
John Barrett.
I want to say something about what our first extraterritorial prosecutor said about the importance.
Okay. I'll do some digging and I'll get you a nugget.
Okay.
I send greetings, by the way, from Stan Lundeen.
Oh, how is Stan?
Stan is fine, and he's been appointed by Governor Spitzer to head up a conference and a process where they're going to look at shared services and basically eliminating a lot of municipalities. So Stan is got to be there literally tomorrow.
Okay.
So hopefully our paths will cross briefly, but in case it doesn't, they want to spend his best.
He's an old friend. We used to run together. Is he still running?
Doubt it.
How's his physical health? Is he all right?
He was fine. He had a little bit of issues, and I'm not exactly sure what they were, but it sort of sidelined him for a little bit. But he's fine now. He's very active, extremely active.
Good.
And he's on the board of the Jackson Center, among other things he keeps very busy on. So Milwaukee, Wisconsin is
That's my hometown.
as it was.
Yours?
Mine too.
Where'd you grow up?
Wauwatosa.
All right, I was just
How about
slightly.
you?
I was slightly south of you. I was in the west side of Milwaukee,
Okay.
49th and Center.
Oh, okay. Okay. I know exactly where you're from. It's a good town.
There were 3 of us were elected to Congress. 4 of us. They were all from Milwaukee, and all were there at the same time. None of us represented Wisconsin. One was I can't remember their names. One was Phil Burton, who was a congressman from California. He and I went to Washington High School, actually together, though I didn't remember him. Then he left out to California. The other was Pete Stark, who was from Wauwatosa, and he's still in Congress. And there was me, and the 4th one was elected in a special election from Orange County. It was John Schmitz. I don't know if you remember that name or not. He ran for president.
And he went into, wasn't he an astronaut?
No, that's somebody else.
Different.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is a guy who was
John
Nixon's congressman.
Right.
He said that he didn't mind Nixon going to China. It was just too bad he came back. He ran for president on the Wallace Party, on the American Labor Party.
Right.
Anyway, so Phil brought him over because he had known him from state legislative days, and we were reminiscing about all growing up under a socialist mayor.
Right.
Because we'd all grown up under Dan Honan. Schmitz looked at the 3 of us, all liberal Democrats, and he said, well, it had an effect on me too, but not the same as on you guys.
For biographical purposes, Judge, give us a little bit of your career path as literally graduating from the high school you talked about, working your way up to finally being appointed a law clerk for Supreme Court Justice Sherman Minton.
Well, I finished Washington High School. I was 17 and a half in 1943. I had already enlisted and was in the U.S. Army Air Corps. They wouldn't take anybody until they were 18, and so on 18 plus 4 days, I went down to Fort Sheridan as a private in the Army, and then not switched over, but ended up being assigned as a cadet and then the Army Air Corps, and trained as a navigator, became a navigator on a B-24 and graduated in May or June of 45. And the war was already over in Europe and was beginning to wind down in Japan, and when we crewed up out in California, WJ Day came around and they were paying us as getting flying pay. We were getting an astronomical amount of several $100s a month as a second lieutenant, and the government decided that was too much money to pay for us flying around the western skies. And so we were discharged very early. I came back, started college at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, then went to Madison for a year, the following year. Met my present wife, started courting her. She was from St. Louis, and her mother, who found me attractive compared to the other galoots she'd been bringing home, decided that she would bring her back to St. Louis because I'd have a better shot there than at the University of Chicago, which is where she was going to school. So we came back to, she came back to St. Louis, and I moved down there went to Washington University for a year. In those days, you could get into law school with 3 years of undergraduate, which is what I had. We agreed after we were married, we'd come back to Chicago, and she would get her master's, and I would go to law school there. And I did, and she did. And I did well in law school. And Edward Levy was then the dean of the law school, and he decided it was time to refurbish the law school's credentials, and it was important to get a clerkship, which we hadn't had in many, many years. And so he literally camped on Sherman Minton's doorstep, who was then assigned to the Seventh Circuit. It was with the court he had come up to the Supreme Court from. And Minton agreed to interview me, and I came into Washington and was interviewed. And I still don't know how it happened, but I obviously had one of those good days you sometimes have when you're being interviewed. And he hired me, sent me a handwritten letter saying, I've decided to take you on for next year, be here in August. And lo and behold.
What did you know about Judge Minton beforehand?
Well, I'd studied up on him a little bit. I'd vaguely remembered him as being a great New Dealer, which he had been. He was one of the whips in the Senate for Roosevelt. He had sponsored the court packing bill, or one of the sponsors of it, which was one of the bad marks that some of my law professors gave him for having pushed that, what they thought was a bad idea. And he also sponsored a bill at one time which got him a lot of grief from the newspapers to license newspapers. They were giving Roosevelt a particularly hard time, and he put in a bill to require licenses, and it didn't go anywhere, but he was remembered for it. He was a great liberal, and when he lost his seat, he was there from 34 to 40 from southern Indiana. And when he lost his seat, he was appointed to the Court of Appeals by Roosevelt, and he served there for 4 or 5 years. But he'd had the good fortune that in the late 30s, before he lost his seat, he was Harry Truman's seatmate. And he and Harold Burton were Truman's lawyers. So that when Truman became president, his first two of the first 3 appointments that he made were to Minton and to Burton. And when he came on the court, as you may know, he was one of the more conservative justices on most of the issues that were important at the time, civil rights and civil liberties more than civil rights. He was pretty good on civil rights. Anyway, he was much more conservative than his Senate record would have indicated, but he explained that by saying, well, he basically was a conservative from downstate Indiana, that what happened was he was asked to run as a Democrat because there was room in the Democratic Party and there wasn't any in the Republican Party for young lawyers. And lo and behold, it was 34, and he was swept up on Roosevelt's coattails, and he knew what got him to the Senate, and he was going to be loyal to them. But once he was appointed to the court, he thought his responsibility was to do what he thought was right. And most of the time what he thought was right was very conservative.
You're the perfect person to ask about this. Do you think there is a difference in one's appropriate temperament in the political branches as opposed to being on the bench?
I think so. I always thought that one of the reasons that the court has struggled so with some of these difficult problems is that nobody on the court has any elected political experience. Until recently, Sandra Day O'Connor was the only one, and she's gone now. So there's nobody on this court that has ever run for anything, and that's too bad, because you learn a lot of things about compromising, about collegiality, about understanding the ebbs and flows of a democratic society if you're running for elected office, and you don't necessarily learn those in academia or in the executive branch. And so as I look over the justices that I knew or that I was, when I clerked, the bright ones were by and large, the ones who knew how to make the court work the way it should were the ones who'd had legislative experience. Hugo Black, I always thought, was a really incredibly effective justice. Jackson was almost the exception. I don't think he'd ever had any elected experience. He'd been Attorney General, yeah. But which is a pretty broad-reaching office, and you learn a lot from there, I think.
Right.
But even so, it was more that he was such an elegant wordsmith that made him as successful as he was. We always used to tease, he was the least educated man on the court. He didn't have a law degree. But, and my boss was the most educated. He had an LLM from Yale. But I think there was a general consensus that Justice Jackson could write rings around Justice Minton.
You're describing a kind of continuity. Political skills serve one well on the bench.
Right.
Some people suggest that political behaviors are an approach that should cease once one becomes a judge.
Some pieces of political behavior should cease when you become a judge. You shouldn't exhibit the passion that elected officials are supposed to exhibit and are expected to exhibit. You shouldn't be writing purple prose. That's not what good judges do. But on the other hand, you should remember that just because you've thought of something doesn't make it absolutely right, and that it's come down from Mount Sinai. So many judges tend to feel they've been anointed instead of appointed by the time they've been on the bench for a while. And that's one thing that never happens to you when you're in elected office, especially if you come from a close district like mine. I never felt comfortable in my seat, and I always felt that I had to pay attention to where other people were coming from and find out how I could make common ground with them. Earl Warren was, to my mind, a perfect example of a good justice, not because he had these great judicial qualities as such. He had never served as a judge before, and indeed his experiences with the law were kind of dismal. He was the main pusher for the relocation camp, Japanese relocation camp policy in California as Attorney General. But he understood the give and take, the ebb and flow, how you get people together. Justice Brennan, who never had political experience as such, but grew up in a political family, and I guess you can't breathe in New Jersey unless you understand politics. But he'd say, "What's the first rule of the court?" And he'd hold up his hand like that. 5. You got to get to 5 to make a difference. And he learned how to bring people around. I've always been grateful that Scalia, who can be very charming personally, has never learned that role judicially, because if he had been as charming in his court writings as he is in his personal behavior, he probably would have fashioned a majority long before now. And even now he's fashioning it in spite of his personality. He still knows how to tear people apart when he doesn't like what they've written. So I think that the kind of behavior, as they say, you should eschew if you go on the court is the political behavior of trying to be popular, to be well liked. But on the other hand, even trial judges have to know how to get along with other people. The successful trial judges are the ones who can handle their lawyers, who can handle the juries, who can handle their colleagues, and who can handle the courts of appeals. The judges who remain less successful are those who insist that they have the right idea and nobody else's views count.
Now, with Minton having political skills and political background, is it unfair to think that he didn't really use them as much as one could have on the court? I mean, he's not a leader of an approach or somebody who...
He didn't use them as much...
Too junior.
Well, that's part of it. He didn't use them as much as he could have, and he wasn't there long enough to really make a mark. There were 3 kinds of important issues, putting aside Youngstown, which is fun to go through the earlier reports of what the big cases were coming up. No one mentioned Youngstown as an
Right.
important case, and we didn't think of it as an important case at the time, or at least that's my recollection. I'll see what my colleagues say. But the three important kinds of cases were, there were a lot of the communist cases coming up, the Smith Act and the loyalty oath cases and so on. There were a lot of civil liberties cases coming up, some in the communist era, but a lot of them in the criminal area as well. And then there were a lot of cases dealing with for want of a better word, the relationship between states and the federal government, but it wasn't really federalism. It was sort of, they weren't ready to go back to the Van de Vander court days of saying that the Congress can't do anything. But on the other hand, they were, for the first time since the New Deal, looking at some of these cases, like Youngstown and others, and saying, well, even though Congress is the first branch, there are limits on what they can do and what they can't do, and that at least was one of the struggles. Minton was not doctrinaire on any of that. He was pretty good on civil rights. He wasn't much on civil liberties. He wasn't at all sensitive to what the communist cases were portending for the First Amendment. He was pretty good on the federalism, or the quasi-federalism cases that were coming up, because he saw things from the congressional point of view. But he did not use his political experience to build majorities. The only one who really did that, well, Black did it very successfully. Frankfurter tried, but was not the most diplomatic soul on the court. And Vincent tried a little bit, though. Again, he came out of the Congress, but he didn't. I just don't think he had one of those. Certainly didn't have the kind of personality that Black had, or that Warren had later on, or that Brennan had, that charms people and brings them together.
One classic case that you didn't talk about, and it wasn't before the 1951 term specifically, as far as being heard in oral arguments, was the segregation case.
It was heard for the first time, as you know, in '51. Some of us as law clerks thought of it as an important case. It was getting some attention in academia, but not that much nationally. And I still remember, again, I hope my colleagues back up my memory. We used to invite justices down for lunch, and we invited Justice Frankfurter down one time. This was late in May, just about this time of the year, and it's clear they'd already argued the case. It was then a North Carolina case. I don't remember the name of it, but it was basically Brown versus Ward, and no opinions were circulating, so it's clear they weren't going to come down with the case that year. This was May 1952. And one of the clerks had the temerity to ask him, Justice Frankfurter, why aren't we doing anything about the school case? And he looked at us, all these wet behind the ear male law clerks, and said, why, young man, don't you realize this is a social revolution that we're talking about? Do you want us to bring it down in an election year? And we gasped, and poor Frankfurter, one of Frankfurter's clerks was Abe Chase. I think he was looking for a hole to fall through in the floor. Yeah. And the clerk persisted and said, well, what does that have to do with it? And Frankfurter was very explicit. He said, here it is, we're in the middle of a hot election, and we come down with that decision. It's going to literally just divide the country. The Republican candidate is going to come out against it. The Democratic candidate will come out for it. Neither one will have read the opinion. Is that the way you want this important decision to be brought into the public arena? Well, it was Stevenson running against Eisenhower. I'd like to think that Stevenson might have read the opinion. I don't think Eisenhower ever did, and he certainly was against it. He expressed his views against it quite vocally when he was president. But if that had come out in the campaign as a public position that Eisenhower was against it, what would have happened in Little Rock? Would he have brought out the troops? Or would he have said what one of his predecessors said? The Supreme Court's made its decision, let them enforce it. So it was not, as I said, we were aware of its presence, but I think we thought of ourselves as being ahead of the curve, that most of the bar and most of the rest of the American public weren't thinking that this was going to be the end of segregation.
One of the questions we've asked some of the other clerks is if you had a chance to work for another justice other than the one you did, who would you choose and why?
I think I would have chosen Justice Black. First of all, I liked the fact that he'd had political experience. I liked the fact that he'd had this capacity to change his mind about important issues, that he really remained open to self-instruction and to learning what it was about. He was claimed to, or somebody accused him of having gone through law school backwards because he went did he go to Alabama originally for law school?
Yeah, so, yeah.
And then he enrolled at Harvard, or at least started taking courses at Harvard, and started taking third-year courses and going back. So the effect had the equivalent of a degree from Harvard as far as the courses were concerned. But after he'd gone to Alabama, and after he decided that he had learned all the national law he should learn at Alabama. And he had that attitude about the learning process. Here he was, this charming, friendly, easygoing justice, but who understood the way the court was supposed to work, and perhaps in many respects, when you consider the California case incorporating the Bill of Rights into the Due Process Clause, perhaps had as much impact on personal rights as any justice ever. Adams versus California. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Did you have much chance to interact? I mean, you mentioned lunch in Frankfurt, or do you remember hallways,
Yes.
conversations, or other justices coming to lunch with the clerks?
I remember two things particularly. Douglas, who office right next door to Minton, we were on the same time track, so that every morning as I was coming in walking to my clerk's office, he would be on his way to the chambers, and I'd say, "Good morning, Mr. Justice," straight ahead, not a word, not hello, not a nod, anything. Many years later, when I was in Congress, and another congressman and I were trying to save his hide when Congressman Ford was trying to get him impeached. He was then married to Kathy Douglas, who was a wonderful woman, and she invited us over for dinner one night. And this was, I think, just before his stroke. But, he couldn't have been more charming. And I kept thinking, that's not SOB. He wouldn't even nod at me when I was a clerk. Now, all buddy. The other incident I remember is that one time the clerk who was in charge of the invitations invited Black and Douglas down for the same lunch. And Black frequently ate in the cafeteria with his clerks. He'd sit with them, whereas Black always ate upstairs in the justice's dining room. And when we came in, Black had gone through the line with his clerks, and the rest of us were all gathered around the Black, chattering with him and chatting with him. And we walk in, and there's Douglas being served by his messenger who had brought his food down from upstairs. And Black grinned and said, "Well, Bill, how's the man of the people today?"
You mentioned something. The messenger brought down the meal. Did he have a special diet?
No. That's just that the messenger. I assume the food came from the same dining room, but it was just as a matter of service as opposed to going through the line by yourself. Douglas was a complete loner.
In that, sort of on the brink of Brown moment.
Yeah.
Was there did you have any sensitivity to the messengers and how they served the justices and the kind of black-white dynamic in the court?
Not much. I mean, some of us were a little more sensitive because we came from the north. I was still shocked by how segregated Washington was, where blacks would step off the sidewalk if a white was walking by and step down into the gutter to get by. And everything was totally segregated. 2 sets of schools, separate buses, separate restaurants. And so that didn't surprise us too much that the messengers were black and everybody else was white. There, of course, were no black clerks. I think Frankfurt had his first black clerk a few years later.
It had been earlier.
Bill Coleman. That's right, in the late 40s, right. And so, but there were no blacks.
But not repeated again
till when? Late 50s?
I think when Tyrone Brown clerked for Warren, which was like 67, 68.
That's right. Coleman had served in the late 40s or mid 40s. But there were no blacks, there were no women. We had no women clerks. These were all male clerks, mostly from the Ivy League schools and Stanford. And I was the first Chicagoan in many, many years. Dick Walker came late that year or the following year, and he was from Chicago, but we were the first ever, or ever in a long time. And we weren't really conscious of it. And I don't think, again, I was rereading some of the news stories at the time, until Brown versus Board was argued, or until the predecessor to Brown versus Board was argued. I don't think there was a single mention in any of the clips that this was one of the important cases coming up that year. I know that that Youngstown wasn't mentioned, but I think they were so full of cases like Feiner and the Smith Act cases, and it was a stomach pump case, Roshan, yeah, which was that year. I really thought that was the most important case that was being decided that year, because it shocked even Frankfurter's conscience, and that was hard to do.
Do you remember any Jackson interactions or a Jackson lunch with the clerks? Or?
I don't. I do remember that everyone thought of him as very pleasant, and that we found it kind of odd that George Niebank, who was one of the most outgoing, personable people, and Bill Rehnquist would be the two Jackson clerks. They couldn't have been more unlike each other.
In what way?
That Niebank was just very outgoing and enthusiastic about things, and Rehnquist just was a loner. He was mean or anything. He just kept
So you
his
guys
own
didn't
counsel.
become particularly acquainted, you and Rehnquist?
Yeah, we did because of the poker game.
Okay.
You were part of the Heilman's poker game? Or was it Charlie and Marge? Did you play with you and your wife?
No.
Bridge.
This was a real
Bridge.
this was a real poker game, and with stakes that were,
Oh, really?
by those standards,
This is during
substantial.
the law clerk year? Or
Oh
later?
yeah, during the law clerk
Oh,
year.
tell us more.
Oh, that was a great game. It was the oldest established floating poker game in Washington. It had been started many years before, and it was kept going by the clerks. There were occasionally ex-clerks that sat in. Hans Lindy was a member of the poker game. He was a regular. He and Howard Trenins were the two best poker players there, and Rehnquist was absolutely the worst. He always drew the inside straights, and Trenins and Lindy's eyes would light up when Rehnquist would come into the poker game, because they knew they'd do well that night. It was a pot limit game. We'd start with a nickel bet, but because it was pot limit, I think there was a limit on the number of raises, but because it was pot limit, the hand could be worth $30, $40 at the end of the night, which in those days was a lot of money.
Yeah.
And
Where did you play? Where was
different people's houses.
Okay.
Yeah, there were no set places, I recall. The other amusing story about Rehnquist in that is that when Rehnquist was nominated for the court, I was in Congress, and Adlai Stevenson III was our senator. And Adlai is a very principled guy, and he was getting under a lot of pressure from the unions and other liberal groups to oppose Rehnquist. And he called me one time and he said, "Ab, you served with that fellow. Is there any principled reason I can oppose him?" And I said, "Sure, Ad. He used to draw it inside straights." Well, Adlai doesn't have a sense of humor, and he said, I don't understand. I said, no, you should vote for him. And it's always been a good story for me to tell. And one night, in fact, I think it was at that reunion we had of the clerks, I told it to Rehnquist. He didn't think it was funny. He said, "I never drew the inside straights."
You didn't know him from Milwaukee, did you?
No, but that was another one of those stories. There were three of us who were law clerks at the same time, who were all from Milwaukee. Rehnquist, me, was it Niebank?
No, he was from Buffalo.
Jamestown.
Jamestown, actually.
There was a third. Oh, Minnow, Newt Minnow, of course.
Right.
We're all from Milwaukee, and the Milwaukee Journal did a little spread about that.
Yeah.
The three of us had all had these coveted spots all in the same year.
Okay.
But
Now, in later years, there was the Rehnquist poker game.
yeah, I didn't
Were
get
you a
into
part of that?
No, that was for his friends.
Okay, gotcha.
We were friends, but I was certainly not an intimate.
Okay. And you supported his confirmation
Oh, sure.
in 71?
Yeah, but I didn't
Right, and you're not
have
in
any.
the
I
Senate
was
side.
in the kind, but I thought he would be a good justice, and he was.
Mhm.
And I certainly thought he'd be as good as we'd get out of Richard Nixon, and he
Okay.
probably was.
As you reflect back on the term itself, maybe outside the steel seizure case, what was the highlight? I mean, you look at experience, you block off, and you started before we went on camera saying this was the most interesting year of your life. And you, with a smile on your face, said, "Oh, it went downhill after that," which I know is not true, but
Well, it's true, but not really.
no, clearly isn't. But as you reflect back on it, what was it during that year that made it so special?
Well, first of all, I had never been to Washington before I interviewed with Justice Minton. I had never been involved in any, well, I'd been a soldier in World War II, but other than that, I'd never been involved with government in any way. And all of a sudden you drop down into what feels like the center of everything that's happening in Washington. You're right at the focus of all these important things, and you're reading about them in the newspaper and reading about them in law reviews and talking to these people, all of whom are very bright and very, very ambitious and very enthusiastic about government. I guess that was one of the reasons that Rehnquist was a loner. Almost everybody there, whoever they clerked for, were pro-government. We all thought that government, we were New Deal clerks. We still thought that government was a positive force in people's lives and should be treasured. Rehnquist, I think, even back then had misgivings about, not quite going back to the years before the switch, but really reluctant to think that government was a positive force in people's lives. And it was exciting to see these things that were going on and having our internal debates in the clerk's lunchroom and on the way to work in the morning. I was in a carpool with Ray Gray and I think Howard Trenans, I'm not sure, and the administrative assistant for Senator Richard Russell, whose name escapes me now, but a lovely guy. We would have these marvelous arguments about the Korean War and what was going on there, and would Minton take the Secretary of Defense office, which there were rumors about, and Jackson had come back from Nuremberg and had accused Black of a cabal that kept him from being Chief Justice, and yeah, that was already passed, but it was still being talked about, and here we were right in the core of all those things.
Yes.
And it was just very, very exciting.
Well, speaking of that, Jackson Black, did you observe, what was the relationship as you observed it from the outside looking in?
Cool.
So,
Again, what was so unusual about it is that Black just really was the most gregarious person on the court. He got along with everybody except except Jackson, because that just somehow seemed to have caused a rift.
did either Bill Rehnquist or clerk for Jackson or the clerks for Black, did they talk to you about that? Was this sort of a luncheon conversation, or?
I don't think so. I think we sort of talked about it with clerks other than either Blacks or Jacksons. It apparently was still a sensitive thing. There was no interplay, even though they frequently voted alike, but there really wasn't any interplay between Jackson and Black during our year, at least none that I remember. And there was, for instance, Black, could tease Douglas, as that story indicates, and there was other sort of, involvement with all the other justices, but not with Jackson.
Right.
So it clearly rankled still.
Was Jackson in vigorous health?
I think so. I was trying to remember that. Black, as I recall, played tennis with his clerks regularly, several sets a day, and one of the other justices was very much Douglas was this big hiker, but I don't seem to remember. Jackson always looked very healthy and looked in good condition, but I don't remember his being involved in any athletic activities of any kind.
He wasn't much for, kind of group sports
No.
or ball games.
No.
He would, ride. He had horses at his home.
Okay. See, that
he-
we would never see.
You wouldn't see.
Did he golf?
Didn't golf. I mean, he played
Yeah.
around now and then, but
Yeah.
he'd go fishing out on the bay. He'd hike in the woods. He'd ride.
Yeah.
You
See,
he
those are
certainly didn't
things
get the aerobic exercise we would
Yeah.
recommend today. but
Those are things we never saw. And Douglas, on the other hand, was so aggressive about his
high
hiking.
visibility, right.
He was hiking down the Potomac
Right.
Canal and gathering groups of environmentalists to march with him, and marrying a lot. So.
Was the political context of 1952 and potential political futures for justices a topic that you remember? There's a little bit of will Vinson run for president? Will Douglas run for president in the press?
Yeah, there wasn't anything about Vinson. I mean, he clearly, he was a wonderful storyteller, and we used to frequently gather around and he'd tell stories about life in the Congress or when he was Secretary of the Treasury and so on, and his poker games with Truman. But I don't remember anything about his being president. The two pieces of political gossip that Douglas was always being promoted to run for vice president or president, and he was clearly pushing the idea. He was very restless on the court. He probably was restless after 2 days. His attention span was not the longest ever. And Minton clearly was not restless on the court, but thought of himself as, I think he wanted to get back into the more active piece of government. So he did promote his own candidacy for Secretary of Defense, which didn't happen. And I think those were all, Douglas and Minton. Frankfurter certainly didn't. Jackson did not, though Jackson was considered, I think that the other justices, and this may be hindsight, and maybe thinking back about how significant that concurring opinion was in Youngstown, I just seem to remember that I had the feeling even then that Jackson was held very much in awe by the other justices, that he seemed to be able to handle the job so much more facilely than they did. I certainly felt that way. I certainly thought that Minton felt that way. Because to Minton, writing was not that easy a chore, and I don't think he really understood the function of opinions as such. And compared to the elegance of Jackson's phrase-making and prose, I think that Minton probably wished he could do that.
Anything particular, John?
What did this year mean in your life, given everything you went on to do later?
Well,
were you steered in those directions by having been a clerk?
Yeah, partly. Minton was a creature of the legislature, and so whenever we had any time, he would urge us to go over and sit in the balcony, in the House and the Senate balcony, and I used to watch their trivial pursuits that they do when there's not something important up for debate, and I was fascinated by it. I was fascinated by the language and the protocols and the whole regimen, and I'm sure that it influenced me to a substantial degree to want to run when I got the chance to. But also it was and is one of the most important credentials I've ever had. It's still, I'm amazed that they will leave out other things, but when they're talking about my curriculum vitae, they always say he served as a law clerk. And sometimes they don't even remember the justice. They'll say Justice Frankfurter, Justice Vinson, Justice whoever. But they do remember that I was a clerk. And so it was part of it was my first exposure to the process of networking. Now, it wasn't that I continued to network with all the people that I clerked with, though Newt and I had grown up together in Milwaukee, and so we became even closer friends. I did get to know Howard Treenans, and we continued to network all through the years. And some of the others, Vince McCusick, wouldn't be in a lot of touch, but what little there was, I would remember that we had gotten along as clerks. Hans Lindy was another one.
Mm-hmm.
So it was, as I say, it was the first exposure I'd had to the idea of networking, especially on a national level.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think it was the first time. It wasn't that I didn't think government worked up to that. I was a New Deal baby, as I indicated, but I'd never understood why it worked or how it worked until that year as a clerk. And I began to realize that there really was some special magic about the separation of powers, and that there was something special about the way we elected some people nationally and the others regionally, and then had these appointed justices, and that there was an interaction between the three that made it work incredibly well.
I love the gleam in your eyes when you talk about this. It's really interesting. Subsequent to your law clerking days, you had a chance to have a period of time with Arthur Goldberg. Talk to me about him.
Well, I first came across him in the steel seizure case. He was arguing for the steel workers, and I think he was given 5 minutes, as I recall. I know he wasn't given full time. And he made more sense in those 5 minutes than John W. Davis did for the steel companies, and more than the Solicitor General, Perlman, who was very uncomfortable about his role, who didn't really like the assertion of power that Truman wanted the government to take, and so was hedging and hawing. And Goldberg was the only lawyer who argued that day who I thought made a great deal of sense, and he did it in 5 minutes. And I wanted to be a labor lawyer anyway, and this just seemed to be a perfect match. And when after Youngstown came down, and it was no longer important that there was no longer a conflict, I went to interview with him, really hoping I would be hired in Washington, because that's where I wanted to stay. And he said, "No, we'll hire you. We need you in Chicago." And
this is with the steelworkers.
Well, it was actually with his law firm.
Oh, his law firm.
Which was then Goldberg and DeVoe, two partners. And I was a little reluctant about going back to Chicago. I thought I'd do a little other interviewing around, but clearly the only other place that indicated some interest in me was Governor Stevenson, who was not, this was the early part of 52, well, late in 52, no, middle of 52. He wasn't yet running for president, but there was talk about it. And I thought, gee, it would be kind of fun to work for him. And Newt Minow was going to work for Stevenson. And I thought, well, maybe I'd go there too. They were a little reluctant about putting too many people on his staff, so they said they'd hire me, but to work for one of the other state officials, and that sounded like I'd be off the mainstream, besides which by that time Goldberg had decided he wanted me, and he was telling me all the reasons not to go to work for Adlai Stevenson. So I came on. I still remember Goldberg always painted with a broad brush, and he said, "Now, of course, we'll do better than any salary you're getting at the court. What are you getting now, Ab?" And I said, $5,200 a year, and all the blood drained from his face. He said, "My God, that's more than one of our partners is getting." So I gave everybody a raise.
Yeah, you've heard that story already.
And I went to work for $5,200 a year, exactly. He didn't make me take a cut.
Did you stay close to him in later years?
I did. He was a fabulous partner. He was a fabulous lawyer in those days. And it really wasn't until he went to the UN that he lost his common touch. He really was an incredibly good speaker. The unions, just the union memberships, not the brass, not the pork choppers. The members adored him because he was so friendly and so enthusiastic and so vigorous about his. And when he went to the UN, I don't know, maybe it was because he did in fact regret leaving the court, though he never admitted that. Maybe it was just that you can't be called the king of the Jews and the top diplomat in the world without beginning to inhale. But he just lost all of that modesty and
he had that run for governor.
That was awful. That was dreadful, right? But after he left all that, he did get his sense of humor back. He used to tell the story that when he was running for governor, that he'd read in the press that people said he was much too arrogant and much too aloof around people. And how he read that one time in the New York Times, and he slammed down the paper and turned to his wife and he said, "They're saying I'm arrogant. Am I arrogant, Dorothy?" And she said, "No, Mr. Justice, you're not."
Here's a closing note.
Okay.
Are you a baseball guy?
Sort of.
Okay. White Sox, Cubs, or Brewers?
White Sox.
White Sox, okay.
I grew up in the South Side.
Got
I mean,
it.
I grew up, but I lived in the South Side of
Hyde
Chicago.
Park. Goldberg represented Kurt Flood.
Yes, he did.
Disastrously.
Yes, he did.
And there's a new book about that case.
Oh, really?
Which I recommend to you, even though the Goldberg part is really painful. His oral argument was a disaster.
Oh, it was terrible. He was already past his prime. It was like John W. Davis arguing the Seizure case.
Okay. Although he was better than Perlman, wasn't he?
Davis? Because Perlman was so conflicted. I mean, he didn't, on the one hand, on the other hand, he was like a professor talking about a subject he didn't like anyway and trying to give you both sides. It was hardly that of an advocate. It's interesting. There were one of Minton's favorite stories was that he went to see Truman about when Truman had already indicated they wanted to put him on the court. It was in the middle of the World Series, and Truman had the set on. He wasn't much of a baseball fan those days, and Minton had played semi-pro ball, and the set's on, and Minton turns to the president and says, "Mr. President, that man up there can hit a homer anytime he's up at bat." And Truman said, "Oh, is that so?" At which point the man hits a homer. And Truman says, "If you can call him like that on the court, as you can here, you'll be a great justice."
There's David McCulloch. I said I was done, but one more question, and we'll talk about this more tomorrow. In his Truman biography, he reports on the ex parte Vincent Truman conversations. Do you believe that stuff? And given Minton's vote and his relationship, do you think there was any Minton Truman?
Oh, sure, absolutely. But it was a different time.
Okay.
And I don't know how to say this because, I mean, I should have been as horrified then as I would be now.
Right.
But for some reason, especially on an important policy case like that, and it was a policy case, that case could have been decided either way, as Jackson said in his concurring opinion. And here were these people who had had long-standing relationships with this president who was struggling to trying to find the way to be a good president. It just didn't seem wrong for him to consult with them. There's no way he could have threatened them. And in fact, Minton did try to intimate that Truman was going to threaten Clark. What could you threaten? How do you threaten a Supreme Court justice? What are you going to do? And the Clark did leave the reservation, and so did Burton. And both of them were part of that extracurricular activities. One of the stories that was going around at the time, and I don't know if it's true or not, was that Truman and Vincent, who were both regulars in the poker game with Truman, Minton and Vincent, who were both regulars in the poker game with Truman, sat around, were there one night, and Minton was complaining bitterly about Clark's infidelity and Burton's infidelity, and Vincent was trying to be kind of, not defending them, but, not to get to, whereas Truman apparently really took out after them and said, "I'll never forgive Harold Burton for that. He wouldn't have been on that court except for me, and he knows it." Again, but what could he have done to him?
Right.
But there was a lot of talk about it. And in fact, since I have to let the other clerks speak for themselves, I didn't begin to appreciate Jackson's concurring opinion until many years later, until I really began to think about the separation of powers. I think probably the first time I had some kind of constitutional crisis about a bill in either the legislature or the Congress, and I began to think about how he had crafted this delicate balance. And at the time, the case stood for two things. One was that this was an indication of the personal disloyalty of Burton and Clark, and that this was a personal defeat for the president, not didn't have that much to do with government. And the other was that I don't know if you've heard this before, but the great controversial line in Vinson's dissent, which Howard Trenans had crafted, was, "There are no absolutes," and that evoked a Time editorial and all kinds of all the ministers got involved. What are you saying? There are no absolutes. Are you saying there's no God? And all kinds of things like that. And no one, again, I didn't focus, and I don't remember any current. I used to read a lot more law reviews then than I do now. I don't remember any current comment on the real significance of Jackson's opinion at the time.
There isn't much. I mean,
I didn't think there was. I didn't think there was. Because again, you appreciate how prescient he was and how important it was when you start to look at the War Powers Act and some of the other things that we've been struggling with all these last 50 some odd years.
Well, for you, it was a first exposure to those very, very big issues.
Yeah.
And, in some ways, for Jackson was the concluding phase of him thinking about things that he'd been dealing with for 20 years.
20 years. And in at least 2, if not 3 of the branches, again, depending on how active you think the Attorney General was in legislative affairs.
Right. This is super.
Terrific.
It got really hot in here.
You sure it wasn't a conversation?
I was about to say that it was you. This was really hot. This is great.
Thank you.
There will be a van downstairs
Okay.
around at 5 o'clock, and John, if you could sort of herd them into the W2 van.
Okay.
I'm going to leave a little bit early.